Good morning everyone. Welcome to this morning. I'll give everyone a few minutes to enter and make sure I'm letting everybody in. All right. I will just have everybody on that small little part of the screen. That means I can't actually see if anybody raises their hand or anything, but if Carolyn or Hannah want to let me know if there are any questions or anything as I'm going through, that would be great, or just yell out, that's completely fine. Okay, so it's up here. Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I just see there's a message in the chat. Fantastic. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to this introductory workshop for conducting systematic reviews and meta-analyses. It is really great to have so many of you here joining us from all around Australia and also from all around the world, which is really exciting. So welcome and thank you for joining us. Can you just close, oops, this. All right, so I would like to start today by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm talking to you from today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today as well. I would also like to extend my thanks to the co-curricular grant awarded by the Student Life team at the University of Sydney and through the generous mentorship from the Australian Congress for Personality and Individual Differences for making this workshop possible. So I just want to go through and just quickly review the schedule for today. The first session will be a broad introduction to systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And the aim here is to provide an overview of the entire process, focusing in on specific important elements that are either potential traps for first-time reviewers or that are frequently overlooked, or things that I've just found to be important over the last few years. So session 2 is going to be a practical demonstration, which will be run by Associate Professor Carolyn McCann, and we'll walk through the stages from start to finish of getting your review or meta-analysis ready for the synthesis stage, whether that is qualitative as in a systematic review or quantitative as in a meta-analysis. And the stages are essentially the same for this early process, and Carolyn will go through these a little bit later. Session 3 is our first afternoon session, and this will be a hands-on DIY, do-it-yourself session, where we will have a couple of breakout rooms with an instructor in each of the rooms, and you'll be given the opportunity to go through and either replicate the processes demonstrated in session 2 that Carolyn demonstrated in session 2, or if you want to go through and do that or examine the processes as it's related to your own research as well, whether it's looking at how to do a search in the databases, developing a code book, or what kind of effects you should be extracting, any of those sorts of things. There'll be some help from our team for you there. And the final session for this afternoon is session 4, and this is going to be 2 sessions running simultaneously. 4A is going to be Carolyn, and this is going to be a demonstration and practical experience of using Meta Essentials to run a meta-analysis. And you're encouraged to download the data and go through this process alongside Carolyn. And the other session running at the same time is with Dr. Kit Double. And this will be running the meta-analyses in R. And it's strongly encouraged that you attend this session only if you have a background in R and are comfortable already with using R. If you're not, there will be a recording available after the session, which you can watch and kind of go through that yourself, but it probably would be more beneficial to attend the Meta Essentials portion of the session 4. And I mentioned some instructors, so I'd like to introduce you to them now. First is Associate Professor Carolyn McCann from the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney, and Dr. Kit Double, who is a research fellow also from the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney, and Hannah Kunst, who is a PhD candidate from the Business School at the University of Sydney, and my name is Sarah Walker, and I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney from the School of Psychology. So we are definitely a USyd team here this morning. Okay, so I would like to get started talking about what a systematic review is and what it isn't. But before doing that, I just want to point out that the process of doing a systematic review and a meta-analysis are essentially the same up until the point of synthesis. At that point, they diverge. One is essentially going to give you a statistical understanding of the effects that you're looking at, and the other one is much more of a qualitative idea of the various effects or the methodologies or various things that might be contributing to the effect that you're going to see. So when I'm talking about reviews, up until that process of synthesis, these are things that can be applied to both systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So before launching into what a systematic review is, I just want to touch on what it is not. So it's common for people to confuse systematic reviews with the more traditional reviews that you may know of. So things like literature reviews or narrative reviews or critical reviews or commentaries and things like this. These more traditional reviews are great for providing some background. We see them in research papers all the time. But they differ from a systematic review in that it's extremely difficult to replicate one of these traditional reviews. They're not really a rigorous or unbiased approach to a topic. So there isn't really a necessity in a more traditional review to share the method of how you searched for, selected, or integrated the papers that you've used in that review. So the risk of cherry picking is quite high. In the processes involved in a systematic review, though, and meta-analysis, it's a much more rigorous approach to how the topic, the search, the integration, the selection of papers is done. There are very clear guidelines about the process that should be documented and written up in your manuscript. So the purpose of a systematic review is to collate existing research on a specific research question by synthesizing results across several different studies, and they should be conducted with the same rigor that you would expect when you are conducting primary research. A systematic review uses transparent processes or procedures to find and evaluate and synthesize the results of relevant research. And the procedures are explicitly defined in advance in order to ensure that this exercise is transparent, there's reduced bias, and that it can be replicated in future. So it's a method of identifying and synthesizing research evidence that fits pre-specified criteria to answer a specific question. The studies that are included are screened for quality by a team of researchers in order to minimize bias. And the overarching aim of a systematic review should be to summarize and help people to understand the evidence. And this is just a definition, or one of many types of definitions that you can see about a systematic review. And that is that a review of the evidence on a clearly formulated question that uses systematic and explicit methods to identify, select, and critically appraise relevant primary research, and to extract and analyze data from the studies included in the review. Okay, so systematic reviews have increasingly become a gold standard in reviewing because they aim to adopt a much more scientific approach to identifying and considering all of the evidence pertaining to a specific research question, or to minimize bias in that specific research question or research area. They should be carried out according to specific protocols, which I'm going to go through in a little bit more detail shortly. But this is just a general kind of a snapshot of what we're trying to achieve when we're looking at a systematic review or a meta-analysis. So these processes or these protocols that we're going to go through will set out the scope of the review and details about the methodology that you should be using throughout the process of doing your review. Reviews can also evaluate a range of different kinds of evidence, qualitative, quantitative, or both, but the appropriateness of the synthesis should be considered for the type of evidence that you are particularly looking at. So the whole process of a systematic review has then been designed such or developed that it is going to minimize some of the bias, ensure some of this transparency. And so it's really important that the methods and the documentation process is really clearly set out so that it can be replicated, as I mentioned a moment ago. So I guess the main takeaway from this, which I suppose I also keep driving home, is that when conducted well, a systematic review and meta-analysis should give us the best possible estimate of a true effect. And it's also really important to consider the limitations of the review that you have, which we'll also talk about in a little bit more detail soon. Okay, so what does a meta-analysis or systematic review really tell us? It offers a number of benefits. They can deliver a clear, comprehensive overview of a particular area of research or a particular given topic. Systematic reviews also help us to identify research gaps in our understanding or within the field. They can highlight methodological concerns in research studies that we can use to improve the way that we research a topic in future. And we can also see whether or not there's a really clear effect of something happening and whether or not this can, mean we can stop researching this particular thing and start looking further in what might be the next research type of question that we need to ask in relation to this topic. But as with all research, the value of a systematic review is highly dependent on what was done, so your processes, what was found, your synthesis, and the clarity of the reporting and the write-up. There are some challenges to conducting systematic reviews and meta-analyses. They are extremely time-consuming. They require a lot of what I might call grunt work. They require a lot of attention to detail and the willingness to sit for hours and screening titles and abstracts and reading through method and result sections, and then extracting data into spreadsheets. Reviews also benefit from training. So if you have other team members, you want to make sure that people are not only trained in how to do the various different aspects required in a review, but also have a really clear understanding of what their task is and how they should execute that task. If one person on your team doesn't pay attention or maybe didn't quite understand the instructions or makes a lot of mistakes, the already time-consuming process of conducting a systematic review can become an extremely time-consuming process, as you have to go back and sometimes essentially restart the process. So it's really important to do spot checks and just make sure that, things are ticking along well with regular checks along the way. So that sounds, like there's a lot of complexity in having a team, so why not do it yourself? Well, you could, but one of the benefits of systematic reviews as opposed to other types of literature reviews or background reading, narrative reviews, etc., is that they are supposed to reduce the bias. So if we're going to do one of these things on our own, then it's going to be more susceptible to bias when we're going through the screening process and the extraction process and deciding what studies to include. And there's also going to be some possible additional error. If we miss a paper, then there's no backup person to potentially find the paper that we've missed. And also some of the reporting standards include providing information about rater agreement at each of those screening and extraction process stages. So there's a figure of around 20% that gets thrown around a little bit. That should technically be at least double coded at each of those points in the process. So when I see reviews with just one author, I'm sometimes a little suspicious that maybe there was a research assistant that did a lot of grunt work and didn't necessarily get any authorship or recognition for the work they've done, or that the review might not have been conducted according to the typical standards associated with performing systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So it's something to consider as well. I'm also assuming that if you are here this morning, then you're either going to do a review, have done a review, or are thinking of starting one in the near future. So it's likely that you have a handle on the specific topic that you're wanting to review in. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted when I say this, but a quick review isn't really a thing, and having a really shallow understanding of a particular research field definitely does show it in the end product. So I guess it's good advice for any particular research that you're doing, but reading and having a really thorough understanding of the field of interest is a really key point when doing a review. There are benefits as well. So I do see a question in the chat. On the website and the review section of the website, I've put up some resources that relate to this. Yes, fantastic. Thank you for putting that on. That's perfect. Okay, so there are obviously benefits as well to conducting a systematic review, and hopefully you're going to enjoy the process. I really enjoy the process quite a lot. Apart from having the chance to refine your knowledge and your skills on a particular subject area of interest, you can develop new research ideas and gain critical skills in synthesizing existing literature. But also review papers also tend to be highly cited and tend to be highly regarded as well. So those are things to consider as well. So I'm going to very quickly outline the various stages, as I mentioned a moment ago, and you will also go through this in much more detail with Carolyn in the next session. But just in order to kind of go through that whole process and put it all in one big thing for you, the first step is identifying your research question, refining your research question. And I can't stress this enough. If you have a broad, unfocused research question, you have a broad, unfocused systematic review, and they are impossible pretty much to publish. Be clear and be precise about what it is that you want to examine. So this is an example of a poorly designed research question. So here we have what factors facilitate adjustment in people with anorexia nervosa. The first point is the word factors. What factors? These could be lots of factors. Are they medical factors, psychosocial factors, education factors, diet factors? It's really broad to say what factors are involved. The second word here is adjustment. And what does adjustment mean? What do we mean in particular in reference to this particular question? It's really unclear what exactly is going to be researched as part of this research question. Instead, a more answerable or more focused research question might be something like this: are psychosocial factors associated with anxiety in people with anorexia nervosa, where medical factors are controlled for? So you can already see that this has a much more focused direction. And as you'll see in upcoming slides, this much more focused direction will help to make the protocol development, search strategy, and inclusion/exclusion criteria much clearer and much more manageable. So essentially, you want to formulate a clear, well-defined research question of appropriate scope and define your terminology. Find existing reviews in your area as well, to make sure that the review you're wanting to do hasn't already been done, but also just to make sure that there is a gap where you think there's a gap. There is a need for a systematic review or meta-analysis in this area. And consider using the frameworks like the ones I'm about to show you in order to help you build your protocol and define your question scope and avoid scope creep, which I'm very good at scope creep. It's a killer. Okay, so it's not something to be good at. So once you have your research questions squared away, you need to develop your protocol. And this is technically a separate step, but for the purpose of today, I've included it in the step one. And that is that the protocol is basically a predetermined set of criteria which you're going to use to base your review on. You can and you should pre-register your protocol. There are different places that you can do this depending on your research area. So Prospero, for example, is typically for clinically focused reviews only, but you can also use Open Science Framework like OCF for other types of reviews. And there are other Open Science Framework type places you can as well, but these are kind of the two key ones for registering review protocols. Your protocol should also include a number of things that we're going to talk through a little bit more detail as well, but essentially your selection criteria, your planned search strategy, data extraction, and proposed synthesis method of findings. Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to provide the PowerPoints. Whoops. Okay, right. So these are a couple of helpful resources to get you on track and started developing that protocol. There are multiple frameworks that you can use. These are just 3 of them. The first one here is PICO, which can be PICOT or can be PICOS. It's typically used for clinical work where there is an intervention and some kind of clinical outcome that's being measured. So this first example is almost exclusively related to clinical public health type work. The final 2 here, SPICE and SPIDER, love these names, are much more suitable for social sciences and psychology work, for example. They're much more focused on what the design of the study is, what's being evaluated, the phenomenon of interest, and these sorts of questions. These are also available on the website in the resource section. So again, this is really similar to the last slide. You've got the PICO, the SPICE and SPIDER up there. And you can use these frameworks, as I mentioned, to help build your inclusion and exclusion criteria. And the purpose of your eligibility criteria is so that it provides a framework for the review and sets boundaries about what is and what isn't useful to include in your review for whatever reasons that you've justified. And in fact, this is one of the key features that distinguishes a systematic review from the other traditional types of reviews that I mentioned earlier. It's different because it pre-specifies criteria for including and excluding studies in your review. And this eligibility criteria are essentially a combination of aspects of the questions plus specification of the types of studies that have addressed the question that you're interested in. So this includes the participants, the interventions and comparisons in the question, which can also translate into the eligibility criteria for the review. So if you go back, think back to a couple of slides ago with that answerable question, and how that was such a good focused question that it's really clear at that point exactly what we're looking for. So you can use that to influence and help to populate your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Outcomes are not necessarily part of your criteria for including studies, but again, to keep that question really focused, they probably should be. So when we're talking about outcomes, we might be talking about something like, something broad like extrinsic emotion regulation in the workplace, but you would want to focus that in a little bit more and perhaps restrict those outcomes to something like job satisfaction. So you would have a question that might be a little bit more like, what is the impact of interpersonal emotion regulation on job satisfaction? And so when you're looking for your search, you're going to focus on words or search terms that are related to extrinsic emotion regulation or emotion regulation and job satisfaction. So some of the commonly seen criteria in the literature for inclusion and exclusion include things like whether the population is adult or child, whether the study type of interest is correlational or experimental, whether anyone on the team speaks another language, and you can include languages other than English. So for example, we did a review with a German-based team, so we were able to include German language-based papers as well. And then you also have decisions related to your grey literature. So are you only going to include published studies, or are you going to include conference presentations and dissertations and things like that? So these are all things that need to be considered and decided upfront. So once you have your eligibility criteria down and you're working out those search terms, you can run your searches in the various databases that you've identified as relevant, and Carolyn will go through these more with you, so I won't focus too much on this right now. And just in case you're not sure what the grey literature is that I referred to a moment ago, it's essentially the unpublished research from things like dissertations and conference presentations, as I mentioned. And given that there is, particularly in psychology, a file draw problem where non-significant results tend sometimes not to be published, it can be good to include some of that grey literature, but just be really clear about what is and isn't the grey lit. Okay, so step 3, once you've done the search and you've got all your search results, is to just quickly check the chat first. Whoops, that's really large. Cool. Okay, so the next step, step 3, is screening. So this is your titles and abstract in your full text. And screening is a process where 2 or more people should be involved in going through every single one of the records that you've identified in a specific process to whittle down those initial records into a final selection of studies which will be included in your review. The reason for multiple raters, as I've mentioned, is because you want to minimize bias, but you also want to minimize human error. So if one person misses an important paper, hopefully that second person is going to pick it up. And if there are discrepancies during the process of double coding, then it means that we have a greater chance of identifying potential inaccuracies or mistakes. And a third kind of decision maker can come in and have a look at what those discrepancies are and make a final decision about whether one of them is right and the other one isn't, or if they're both wrong, or if they're both right from different perspectives. It's great being that third person. Okay, so also part of the screening process is that it typically starts with the raters going through the titles and abstracts and identifying studies that are likely to fit the inclusion criteria or clearly fit the exclusion criteria. So for example, if you're doing a review on populations that are you're only looking at adult outcomes, then all studies that are looking at child populations can be excluded. Once you've gone through all of the titles and abstracts, you're left with a selection of full text papers. At this point, you need to make sure that you've got all the PDFs available or the papers available in some format. And you usually review the method and results at this point. You want to review the method to make sure that the variables or the populations, your criteria, meet the predefined rules that you set up, and that the result, and you go through the results section to make sure that the paper has reported the effect sizes that you're looking for. If a paper hasn't reported the effect sizes, there are a couple of different things to consider. Try and contact the authors if you need a zero order correlation, but it's not provided and you can't transform that data from whatever effect size they have provided into a zero order correlation, then get in touch with the authors and see if they can provide you with that information. If everything in that realm kind of fails and you don't have an effect to include, then it's probably not possible to include that paper in your review. And you would exclude that paper at that point. If this is the case and you do exclude a paper because you don't have access to an effect size and can't transform whatever effect size they have into the effect size that you need to make sure that you take note of why that paper was excluded, and that should be included in your quorum chart or in your results section somewhere that you are mentioning that this has taken place. Because remember, transparency and really good record keeping and providing of information is really key. Importantly, remember that you are selecting your studies for inclusion based on your predefined criteria. And again, this is something that Karen will go through more as well. Okay, so would this apply for qualitative systematic reviews? I should have looked at that when I saw the little thing come up, and now I'm not quite sure exactly which bit. Are you talking about the effect sizes? I think you probably would be. Yes, okay, so yes and no. It depends what your qualitative systematic review is going to be looking at. If you are interested in looking at methodology, for example, and you are comparing, say, the way that people report methodology, then the effect sizes don't matter because that's not what you're looking at. That's not the focus of your review. If you're looking for an effect, looking at the relationship between two things, and it's discussed in the paper, but there are no explicit effect sizes for a systematic review, you can still include that paper, but the way that you structure your table would be different. So yeah, exactly. Pretty much what Carolyn has just said. It does depend. It's complex. A lot of this is very much dependent on the context, the review question, and how you execute the review and what it is that you're trying to kind of get out of your systematic review. I hope that kind of helped. So there are a couple of different tools that you can use for managing the systematic review process. This is a very quick look at one called Covidence. It's not free, it's very expensive. So you'd want to make sure that your university has a subscription and use that, but it's a pretty good resource if you have access to it. As you can see from this one, I am a very slack member of this team on this particular project and have done nothing. But we can see that my colleagues have been doing great work on this. And this particular program platform will also put together your Prisma quorum chart. And so I will get to this in a moment, but part of the reporting requirements for a systematic review and meta-analysis is reporting your progress through the various stages of searching and screening in order to lay out that process of arriving at your final selection of papers. So as this particular review reaches the final stages of completion, this quorum chart will automatically fill up with information and will be downloadable for us to include. Covidence is expensive, as I mentioned, and most universities tend to have access to EndNote, and there are also free citation or reference management options available, such as Mendeley, Zotero, that you can also use to help manage your papers and manage your reviews. Each of them take a little bit of setup. The setup is a little bit different for each, but it's just essentially figuring out how you want to manage and run your review at that point. But whatever you do, keeping good records is really important. So EndNote, there are some upsides and downsides. I typically use EndNote to at least start the review process. There's some upsides. Well, there are some downsides. I'll talk about those first. It's a really good idea to have a discussion about tech with your team before you start, especially if you are a remote team and you're not suburbs apart from each other. This is especially true with the fact that EndNote does not like Dropbox or OneDrive or being shared through email or any of those things. A friend and I, during one of the lockdowns last year, had to find a way to share a USB or to do a quick USB handover because we just couldn't figure out why our Dropbox EndNote just kept basically being corrupted. And it turns out after some research that EndNote just doesn't like to be shared online. So these are things to consider when looking at what kind of software or platforms or resource management programs to use. If you do use EndNote or Excel, you can use Excel as well, or any of the other reference management options available. This snapshot essentially will give you a bit of an idea of how it all fits together. So this is essentially which bits of the quorum chart refer to which bits of the process. So we're in step 3 of the process, which is screening. And so this image pretty much captures that search process, the screening process, in relation to where those records are relevant and as part of your quorum chart. So this is a key component of what needs to be reported in your manuscript as well. So let me just quickly check the chat. Okay, I'll just leave that. Okay, so I'm going to be completely honest here. Extracting the data, that should say step 4, I apologize. Extracting the data is not the most fun bit of the process, but it is arguably the most important element. Mistakes that are made here are reflected in your synthesis, and they are reflected in the patterns you find and ultimately the interpretation and conclusions that you present. There's nothing worse than having to redo a colleague's work if they do make mistakes. And it's time consuming and frustrating. So if you are doing this part, if you're doing the extraction, commit to excellence, do it well, have attention to detail. If you're not someone who typically has good attention to detail, own up to it and perhaps do a different task, or perhaps there's a good opportunity to get good and to work on some of those attention to detail bits, and just make sure that you spot check yourself as you go through. Multiple coders here is a good idea. Again, you want to double code at least 20%. And do some spot checks, checking the coding, look for errors and fix them as they come up. multiple coders add to the complexity of team dynamics, and we'll touch on that a little bit later this afternoon. So I just want to take a quick step back.
Sarah, can I stop just a moment? There's a really good question in the chat that would be good to stop and answer.
Yes. Which one?
I thought Roz's was something I couldn't just type into, which is why I interrupted, sorry.
Yes, can you advise how you'd report screening of reference lists within articles within the Prisma and forward-backward citing? Yes. So let me just go back to, this is a relatively simple Prisma diagram for the ease of showing the relationships between the process and the Prisma chart. But basically what you would do is you could have it here if you were going to do some reference chaining. You could put this in here. So it might be additional records identified through other sources, additional records identified through reference chaining, or whatever terminology is best for you, whatever makes sense. Go back and read the question. So that's how you would report it. Pretty much it should go in this first thing because it's one of the things that you find. There is also the possibility when you're looking at one of the more complex quorum charts, there are sections, and there is one particular section, I think it's towards the end, towards the bottom, where you can also have another kind of box that talks about references that have been collected through reference chaining. I will find that particular template and I'll pop it up on the website just so that there is something there. And if, Hannah, would you mind making a note to remind me to do that just in case I forget? That would be appreciated, please. Thank you. So I will put something up there that will have some more information about what to do with reference training. Data extraction, should you aim for one consistent coder during data extraction? Yeah, so thanks, Hannah. So Rosa, it's a really good question. It is very much dependent on the size of your meta-analysis. So if you've got, 30 or 40 papers, having one consistent coder and getting a second person to code 20% or to code all of it, whatever you prefer, is a very good idea for consistency. If you have got like 400 or 500 papers to code, there has to be some kind of trade-off between coder fatigue and coder consistency. So some of the difficulties with having then multiple coders in that time is that things get messy and the cleaning process can be also messy. So you may have a couple of primary coders that go through and they code sections, and then you might have someone who goes through and does 20% of each of the primary coder sections. There's no like perfect way to do it. It depends again on the size of how many papers need to be coded and what it is. Yeah, but 20%, yeah, it's how long is a piece of string? Yeah. So hopefully that helps. A lot of the things that are really difficult in this whole process is that a lot of it is very much context dependent. It depends. It depends. So yeah, if you've got questions like that, feel free to ask and can try and offer some advice and alternatives. Okie dokie. All right, so this is Excel can be your friend. Now, if you look at this and this is extremely scary, don't worry. I really love spreadsheets and I overcomplicate them, but I do it for a reason. So once you have completed that final stage of screening and you're going through and you're pulling out all of the information from the papers, there you need to have somewhere to put that information that you're extracting. There are lots of fancy software options that you could use. I like Excel. It can do a lot of different things really well, and it's a really good piece of software to learn how to use. But basically putting it into Excel is very simple. Carolyn will go through developing code books a little bit more later this morning as well. But basically, a couple of things that you want to notice are when you're putting your effect sizes in, so in this case it's very small, I'm sorry, but this column AC, there should only be one effect size per cell. No words, no explanations. There either is an effect size or there isn't an effect size that you put in here, and it should be just one. And don't, if you're going to have significance, put it in a separate column. The code book is going to vary depending on what it is that you're doing. Okay, so this particular code book is focused on effects. Another code book that I've worked on, and that a different code book that we're working on again, is looking at methodological details. So that code book will be very different and not even talk about effect sizes. So again, it's dependent on what it is that you're reviewing. Small tip, just an Excel tip, which I'm sure you all know, but happens all the time, is when you have a number, like a date up here in cell 3, and you click that and then you pull that down, if you're not careful, line 4 will become 2004, then 2005, then 2006, then 2007. Come data cleaning time, that can be really, really annoying and hard to figure out what goes where. So just make sure to be really aware of the little idiosyncrasies that Excel does to try and help you that can actually be really annoying and harmful. So this is again another complex document of a different meta-analysis. This is an example of, not that you can see all of the different rows, but of multiple raters. So we had 8 people working on this particular spreadsheet. And it took a lot of cleaning to go through and tidy it up and do spot checks and make everything consistent. But now that it is clean, what you'll notice is that there's a lot of consistency in the way, not that you can really see it, it's very small. There's a lot of consistency in the way that the things have been reported. So the citations are reported the same, the years have the same format, there's the same format for the tests or the measures that are being used, the factors that are being measured, and the way that the means, standard deviations, and effect sizes have been reported as well. So again, if this scares you, don't worry, because Excel spreadsheets can be wonderful. And this is a thing I saw online at some point, and as I read it, I thought, this guy sees me, he knows me. Yeah, I love Excel, nobody cares. But fall in love with Excel. It can be really useful in this process. Okay, so everything you've been doing up to this point has led to data synthesis. So all of the screening, all of the extraction, all of this stuff has led to the point where you now want to look at what you've got and what that means. And this is the stage where extracted data is evaluated. So the aim of the synthesis is to bring together the data from the included studies in order to draw conclusions about a particular body of research. So the way the data from included studies is synthesized and presented depends on the type of data being handled. And broadly, we can think of this as qualitative reviews or narrative syntheses, where the results are summarized into text and tables. So here you might be looking at patterns of data and information. You might be looking at analyzing methods that are presented or reported in studies, thematic and content analyses. On the other hand, you might have a quantitative review. So this is a meta-analysis where a statistical synthesis is provided. And you may use forest plots, funnel plots, grouping of similar data, so tables again, and that sort of thing. So these are the two kind of broad ways that we might synthesize our data. Just check the chat. Okay, so you have a beautiful spreadsheet. You've got lots of extracted information from your included studies in front of you. Now what? So this is possibly one of the more obvious reasons why you need to have a really good understanding, or at least have read widely within your research area. you need to look at what information you have in front of you and see what you can see. This is more difficult to explain because it's so dependent on the research question and your research field as well. So first, you just kind of want to look at these overall big picture questions. What are the overall patterns or the common themes that reflect your research question? And under what circumstances are those common themes present? Or is there anything odd popping out? When are those common themes not present? How can you filter it down a little bit more and see what's happening underneath? What is it? What could those things mean? Does the pattern present anywhere else in your data? If you notice a small pattern here, is it consistent pattern? Is it not a consistent pattern? Is it only evident when one particular type of research design is used, like a within compared to a between subject design, for example? Or when a particular measure or instrument is used, or a particular population. So there are lots and lots of different things that you can look for at this kind of overview part, this kind of broad look at the beginning. But this is also where a really critical eye is important. If you don't, well, when people don't look at kind of these, when people only look at the overall patterns and they kind of miss some of those more interesting results, it's so disappointing. But, you know, so don't be those people. Read, think, look, find things that's going on. Don't make up stuff that's going on, but look beyond those kind of obvious low-hanging fruit things and see what's going on underneath. So I was going to give you two quick examples. I'm not sure if I have time, so I will just skip those examples. But essentially, essentially, I suppose the takeaway from those two examples would be to look closely at your research. Look beyond the surface of the data that you have pulled out. Does it make sense? Is there something that keeps bugging you, something kind of eating away at what you think is going on? If there is, just keep looking. Again, don't think you find things. Keep looking in respect to whether it is theoretically and empirically relevant is always important. I won't talk about the quantitative synthesis because we'll be doing that this afternoon. Okay, so now you need to tell people what you found, and there are different ways that you can do this. So there are different guidelines, which is related to a question earlier actually, that are also discipline based. So essentially, medical and public health field are likely to follow Cochrane Review standards and PRISMA, and psychology and more social sciences are likely to follow the APA MARS or the meta-analysis reporting standards to present findings. And the resources for these are also available on the website in the resource section. There are different ways of tabulating your findings, and often, again, this is going to be dependent on the type of review you've done and your research question and what your results are. So I'll give 3 examples here of different kinds of tables that we've used, and there are plenty more examples out there as well. There's no one way of presenting a table in a review, but the main thing is that it's consistent and that it's informative. So in this review, we were looking at the specific types of ways that memory is reported and measured, and the types of and the findings that there were. And this is done in quite a narrative style. So it's looking at specific instances of repeated event. Then we also have this particular study here, which was looking at reactivity to judgments of learning. And again, you can see this is formatted in a very different way. But again, we have still the main kind of things. We've got the author of the year and important elements of the design and results here as well. And this is another one in which is different. Again, this is from a systematic review, but because I didn't want to just kind of narratively review the results, I have put in the actual results for each of the effects for each of the studies as they were relevant. So you can do it in many different ways, but it's just important that the main points that you're trying to get across are communicated clearly. So there's always going to be some limitations to the method that you've chosen, or the way that you've conducted your review, or the studies that have been included. And if you don't do a meta-analysis, this isn't necessarily always the case, but especially if you're doing a systematic review of effect sizes, It's good to mention why a meta-analysis hasn't been done. Perhaps there weren't enough effect sizes, or the data was too complex with the number of effect sizes that you would have in order to meta-analyze. It's good to mention that. Just be upfront and clear about why a meta-analysis wasn't done. If you have excluded some studies for particular reasons, maybe authors didn't respond and you were unable to get the information you needed, but you think that they would have been an important study to include, make sure that you mention that. Talk about the difficulty in hearing back from authors or getting the appropriate information that you needed in order to include, and that may limit some of the conclusions that you were able to make. Again, it's all dependent on what you're looking at, but be honest about your limitations and flip them into future research opportunities. Say how they can be used to develop a theory or further understand patient practice or health outcomes or policy. Okay, so this slide is just pretty much what we saw a moment ago relating to the guidelines that you could use that are appropriate to your field to help you write your paper and to put all the necessary bits and pieces into your paper. And I will go through that this afternoon in a different session, session 3B. Okay, can I answer any questions? Sorry, I rushed that a little bit at the end.
Can I ask Sarah about rapid reviews? So rapid systematic reviews are kind of gaining in popularity. Could you just talk about some of the strategies to make them rapid and what are some of the pitfalls of doing so?
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't actually done a rapid review. So I would probably not 100% know how to answer that question exactly. The pitfalls of doing yeah, I haven't actually done a rapid review, so I'm not 100% sure how to answer that question. Carolyn, have you? I don't think I don't. So is a rapid? I'm not even.
Caroline, you're muted.
Oh.
I stopped my video instead of unmuting myself, sorry. So my understanding is that the biggest thing to make a rapid review feasible is to just limit its scope by having a very specific question. Because the things that you can't do rapidly are these things where there's 2,000 articles. So that might be just like a ludicrously obvious thing to say, but that's like just my 2 cents on that.
I think there's a few papers that talk about limiting sort of second reviewers. But as you were talking, Sarah, I was thinking, well, that probably just increases the risk of bias then. So you may be able to do it much quicker if you've got, if you don't have 2 reviewers, but then you're probably increasing your risk of bias at the end. Yeah.
I think so. So my very, very basic understanding of rapid reviews is you do things less rigorously, I think, than a systematic review. But then, yeah, I think that would take away from some of the robustness that you could probably, the robustness of a systematic review from having done it rapidly. I'm always afraid of things that get done quickly. Not that things should take forever, but I suppose limiting the question, as Carolyn said, would make it much easier to do it more quickly than, something with 2,000 papers. Sorry, I don't know if that was very helpful.
Can I share one thing? Yeah, so rapid review would be, I think, more suitable or usually done within a short time span. You can say last 5 years, or what is the recent development of a particular topic. Basically, the rapid reviews are done in that framework. Then 5 years, or you can say 3 years, last 3 years or 5 years, what they have done in a particular area. So that might be one of the. Thank you. But that's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a good question. I suppose there is also, if a review has been done, from 2015 and you're updating that review, I suppose that could kind of count as an updated. If you're updating that review, the process is already set in place. Gloria has said, how many articles should be included at least? Is there a guideline? So the guideline is everything, but that's not always possible. There is always something that's going to get missed. But essentially what differentiates a systematic review from any other kind of literature review or narrative review or something like that is the fact that you've done a comprehensive search to try and identify as much or all of the research in a particular area, and that all of that research that is relevant and meets your inclusion and exclusion criteria should be included in it. The difference between a scoping review and a systematic review is another good question. So a scoping review is much more seeing what's in a particular area. So say you were looking at gaslighting, for example, you might do a scoping review to see what is out there. What do we currently know about this? There might not be a specific question in the same way that you would have a specific question for a systematic review, for example. I don't know if that was very helpful. Yeah, so I think the main thing is, no, you don't have to do a scoping review before you do a systematic review. It will also come down to partially your knowledge of a particular area as well. So if you know a field relatively well, then your experience of that field kind of is your idea of whether or not there's going to be enough there for a systematic review. A scoping review might be really much more broad in scope, as opposed to a systematic review, which is really focused. So if you have a question, a specific question that you want to ask, then systematic review is what you want to do. And a scoping review is just much more broad and not necessary to do before a systematic review. A framework for time frame. So again, it depends. I feel like I'm saying it depends an awful lot. If you're doing a review that has 40 papers, you can generally get that done pretty quickly. I do have a timeline kind of template on the website in the resource section that you can have a look at. It's again very kind of broad, but if you have something that's got 2,000 papers, you know, it's big. We are working on one at the moment that we're about 2 years and 3 months into. We're getting towards the end, but it just takes a really long time because there were something like 2,000 something papers, and the final selection is something like 400 papers. So it just takes time to go through, especially when you're in a team and everybody has different responsibilities. Have I missed any questions? I don't think so. Any other questions that I can answer in the 1 minute before our break? We have the next session, we have a break for 5 minutes, and then the next session will be Carolyn's demonstration session, which will be followed by, let me just quickly bring up the website. There's a question here as well. I guess those systematic reviews have a set guideline on the process involved. The micro steps depend on the research question. Yes, area specialization, research methodology preference. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So while there are these kind of like, and I'll talk about this more when we do the project management aspect later this afternoon. But while there is a set of guidelines, they are guidelines rather than rules, and that's because there needs to be a lot of flexibility in those guidelines in terms of what the project is, what the area of research is, and how that's going to be, you know, how the little independent tasks are going to be handed out and how people are going to do those. So we do have a break now, and I'm happy to stick around and answer questions now as well, but there's a break just for 5 minutes, and then session 2 will begin. So I'll hand it over to Carolyn at 11:05.